Hello and welcome to another Back to Jerusalem podcast. I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, and I'm coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of Sweden this time. This is a special 4-part Back to Jerusalem podcast, and this is part 3 that focuses on a 5-year plan that China has to transform Christianity. And it's so important for Christians to actually understand what's taking place here. This 5-year plan has kind of been shared a little bit around the world generically if you've been following the news closely and not the mainstream media. The mainstream media is going to tell you absolutely nothing about what we have in this podcast. But this 5-year plan has been known by many missionaries that work in China, but the details of the plan have been a little vague until now. Now we have a special pastor that I've talked about in the other podcast, so you can go back into the previous 2 podcasts that we have in our 4-part series, where we have a pastor that we're calling Pastor Amos, who is the pastor of an underground church and a 3-self church. Now, the 3-self church is at the spearhead of this effort to transform Christianity from the inside out. Why? Because China tried to destroy Christianity and they could not do that. They've tried to end Christianity. They tried to end the Christian practice in China, but they have not been able to succeed. So now they're taking a different approach. And in this 5-year plan, one of the things that we are seeing is that China wants to create a one church of China. This focus is to force all believers to swear credence to one church. It's called the One Church of China because the effort is to bring all the 5 major religions together, not just Christianity. So this church, even though they use the word church, is not just for Christians. It is also for Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestant Christianity. So they want to create one church for all of those religions to come together into one. And they want to put one entity that is above all of those religions in the one church, and that is the state. Now, the new laws in China are labeled as the regulations of religious affairs. So if you ever look at the laws in China, they usually come from the official CCP, the Communist Party of China, or the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. They come from the CCP originally, but then they trickle down to the CCC, the Christian Church of China. So you have the CCP and the CCC and the 3-self church. And so the CCC and the 3-self church, now I know this gets a little confusing. Just hang in with me. I promise I'll make it simple to understand. Because this is important for you, no matter if you're European, American, Australian, South African, listening to this podcast, this will impact you. It's already impacting us in the US. Just last week, from me doing this podcast, we saw that Franklin Graham, probably one of the most well-known evangelical Christians in the world, not just in the U.S., because of his father, Billy Graham. Now, I worked with Franklin Graham for many years. I know him personally, spent time in his office together with him. For several years, we ran Operation Christmas Child. And we delivered hundreds of thousands. I personally delivered hundreds of thousands of gifts throughout Western China, together with Samaritan's Purse, run by Franklin Graham. Last week, Franklin Graham had a delegation from the China Embassy in Washington, D.C. come and join him at their headquarters at the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. During that time, and I'm not saying whether that's a bad thing or a good thing, I think it's great to engage China on an official level. But during that time, China's main focus is the Sinanization or the Chinanization of Christianity, and they are sharing it with the biggest players on the field. Why? Because China wants to bring in individuals that have respect in the Christian community and use them to share their message. Now, I don't know if Franklin Graham's going to be a part of that effort or not, but I see the borrowed boats theory come into play here. What is the borrowed boats theory? Now, you might have heard me share about the borrowed boats theory before in earlier podcasts. You can go back to those podcasts and find them. But one of the things that you will learn about the borrowed boats theory is that it is a PLA term, which is the People's Liberation Army. So the People's Liberation Army actually uses a tactic that they call small or borrowed boats theory. So borrowed boats theory means instead of creating an entire new boat to go and bridge relationships with people, it is better to borrow boats that have already been used, that are already recognized, that are already trusted. This is why China has bought many brands around the world that are recognized and trusted and not known to be Chinese. These brands have been with us for many generations. And when I say us, I'm talking about us in the West. And we've developed a trust into these brands. And China has gone and bought them and then used them for their messaging. So if we look at the trusted brands, just a few of them, we can now see that China has bought Volvo, for instance, probably one of the most well-known companies in the world when it comes to safety for cars. But we also have many different nations that are now owned by China, like Volvo, like AMC Theaters. Why does that matter? Why does AMC Theaters matter? Because now China can only show movies, or China only wants to show movies that push their agenda, that match their policies, that do not attack China, but do attack their enemies, and do give a favorable view to China, or none at all, and a favorable view to China's policies. So AMC Theaters, when they show movies, they may have a movie that comes in that talks about China, the Chinese Communist Party, in a very bad light. Guess what? AMC Theaters, now owned by China, are going to be less likely to show those movies. And we've seen that. We've seen that even some of the major hotel brands. There's one that's in New York, and I'm trying to think of the major one. The Waldorf Astoria, owned by China. Okay, how does a hotel, can you please tell me, Eugene, how does a hotel push an agenda for China? Easy. They pay for advertisement. Where do they pay for advertisement? On radios, TV stations, news networks. And if those radio stations, TV stations, news networks, morning shows do something that China doesn't like, hotels can pull back their advertising spending. There's a lot of power there. So it's borrowed boats tactic. And so what China does is they take these trusted brands to push a communist message, a communist agenda. And you don't even know that it's communist. Why? Because it's coming from a brand that you trust. It's coming from a person that has built up years of legitimacy with you. I just did an article on Back to Jerusalem. I would highly encourage you to look at it. Today, China is the largest news network in Africa. At a breakneck speed. You're not going to hear this really anywhere else in a podcast. Right now, China is working at a breakneck speed to put in and install free satellites throughout all of Africa. And these free satellites have a very basic subscription That's $0. And so you get very basic news, entertainment, and local channels. And just for a small amount, for like $1 a month, you get 26 channels, 4 of which are 24-hour news. All of them are pushed by China. China is pushing a massive takeover of news on the African continent. Don't take my word for it. Look it up. China has gone into Africa. And when we look at Africa, oftentimes we look at it as a monolithic country. And it's not. It's a continent with many different nations. So when I'm talking about Africa, I'm not talking about one country. I'm talking about the entire stinking continent. China's going into Congo, South Africa, Sudan, Somalia, Djibouti. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of all the different nations. Ethiopia, Egypt. Egypt, by the way, even though we think of it as the Middle East, is on the African continent. So all these different nations going in and setting up their own news networks. Now, wouldn't it be odd to hear African news from Chinese? Yes, it would. That's why China has, at a breakneck speed, been training thousands of journalists that turn out thousands upon thousands upon thousands of newsworthy articles and opinion pieces every day. They are literally taking Africans into China for free and training them on journalism, bringing them back to Africa and hiring them through their own news companies, and then having the Africans write the articles, do the news shows, and they are the faces. They are the names. But the message is coming out Chinese. This is information warfare on a level that we've never seen. And nobody's really noticing because it's Africa. This is borrowed boats tactics. And if we look at what we see with the one church of China, it's also borrowed boats tactics. That if you can't change Christianity and the people trust Christianity, then let's not try to replace Christianity, but change it from within. Guys, they're kind of taking a page right out of the LGBTQ notebook. That instead of saying that Christianity is not real and we need to abandon it altogether, instead what the LGBTQ community did, and a lot of other communities like them, they went into the churches and found willing partners within the churches to carry their message for them. Entire denominations have been ripped apart because within the church became changes of messages about the gospel that were not in the gospel. Changes where the gospel had actually gone against what its teaching was in order to embrace a modern day message. And by bringing in Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Catholicism, we are seeing that China is taking this idea of one, notice that they're not calling it one temple of China or the one mosque of China. It's one church of China where all these religions are coming in. And it's due to the new laws in China that are brought in by the regulations of religious affairs. So this goes back to the CCP and the CCC. So the CCP, again, the Chinese Communist Party, and then also the CCC, the Christian Church of China. Here we see that these two are passing down laws to restructure Christianity from within. And the new laws demand that all churches dissolve unless they register with the government And they have to submit to these new rules of China and the China's one church policy. If they don't, they'll be punished, fined, harassed, probably given travel restrictions, evicted from their homes, kicked out of their jobs, fired, having their children kicked out of their schools, arrested, and possibly even prison terms. Pastor Amos said this. He said, "Brother, we are taught to pledge allegiance to the country before Christ. Churches are told to take down their crosses and to put up instead the Chinese national flag, and to place communist propaganda at the front of the sanctuary instead of the cross. And official pastors like Pastor Amos himself are now coming from the ranks of the Communist Party. So the pastors that are coming in to serve along with Pastor Amos are from the Communist Party. Why is that alarming to Pastor Amos and to me? Because to be a member of the Communist Party, you have to swear an oath to atheism. That means that you have leaders of the church in China that are atheists. And now with the integration of Taoism, Buddhism, Islam, who knows what the background of those that are coming within the one church of China. The attempt is to make Christianity a tool to communism itself. And this is not new. The Soviet Union did the exact same thing in South America, and America, North America, the United States of America, saw the repercussions of it just a few years ago. You see, if you go back into the Soviet history in the 1960s and 70s, they tried to make inroads in South America. If they could do in South America what they did in Cuba, then it would at least infiltrate throughout all of South America and then put North America on its heels and go to push communism into the United States as well as into Canada. But they weren't getting any traction. The Soviet message of Marxism was not getting any traction in South America. And they found that the major obstacle for Marxism in South America was Catholicism, the Christian faith of the South Americans, or the Catholic faith of the South Americans, was so strong that it was not possible for most of the South Americans to buy into the idea of Marxism atheism, or Marxist atheism. So because they couldn't get the people in South America to embrace, like they did in Cuba. Cuba was a small island, so a little bit easier to beat everybody into submission. In South America, it was a little more difficult. And when they realized that the message of atheism was not taking root in South America, they changed their strategy and moved into what they call liberation theology. Have you heard that term? If you followed Black Lives Matter closely, you would hear many of their leaders talk about liberation theology. The liberation theology that was being pushed by Black Lives Matter was coming from South America. In South America, it got its life from the support of the Soviet Union. Liberation theology was developed to bring South American Christians under the power of communism and communist regimes. In very simple terms, liberation theology is basically a Marxist attempt to completely overhaul Christian thought by reinterpreting the Bible, the teachings of Christ himself, and the understanding of the sacrifice of Jesus. Just like this one church of China, liberation theology was sold as, quote, shared efforts to abolish the current unjust situation and build a different society, freer and more humane. That is not what communism has a track record of doing. Communism, atheism has never had a track record of bringing justice to an unjust system. That's what they advertise. That's how they sell it to you. That's how they get people to willingly march right into the clamps of their trap to allow all of the power to go to a dictator. In every situation where atheism was tried as a government strategy, it became dictatorship. China, Russia, East Germany, Ethiopia, Cuba, North Korea, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. I can go on and on and on. Different continents, different cultures, different languages, different government structure, but once they come under the banner of atheism, the red banner of atheism, which is Marxism, that believes in no religion and enforces it as government ideology. Every single situation, in every single point in time, in every single culture and language and government, in every single continent that has ever been tried, has failed spectacularly. Failed in the way that it did not bring justice. It brought the exact opposite of justice. It did not bring humanity. It brought the exact opposite of what it meant to be humane or human. It didn't bring freedom. It brought enslavement on a level that we've never seen. It's been tried and tried and tried. And the universities today, now many of the college students of today still preach a message of Marxism. Because if you bring up Stalin, Mao, Castro, Pol Pot, Kim Jong-il, they will tell you, oh no, those don't count. We're talking about socialism. Then they'll usually change, but they're not. They're talking about atheism. At the end of the day, that's what liberation theologians wanted. They wanted to integrate large portions of Marxism and even use the Christian terms, using the Christian verbiage, but with Marxist meanings, with atheist meanings. The Chinese are doing the exact same thing. They did the same thing in the Cultural Revolution. When we see that it says that liberation theology is closely connected to what China's doing now, liberation theologians even quoted the Chinese term Cultural Revolution when writing about liberation theology. Let me read you from one liberation theologian that wrote this. To conceive of history as a process of human liberation is to consider freedom. Sorry, got a message on my phone. I usually shut off my phone before I do my podcast, but I had forgotten to do that. We'll do that now. Let me start again. To conceive of history as a process of human liberation is to consider freedom as a historical conquest. It is to understand that the step from an abstract to a real freedom is not taken without struggle against all the forces that oppress humankind. The goal is not only better living conditions, a radical change of structures, a social revolution, it is much more. It is the continuous creation, never ending, of a new way to be human, a permanent cultural revolution. This terminology was specifically selected when talking about liberation theology. When we see liberation theology, we can understand where China is going today. When we look at the one church of China, We can understand it better for those that are in the West that have been exposed to Black Lives Matter and many Marxist groups that preach about liberation theology. According to one Chinese official plan found on the government website, I'm going to read it directly from the government website for you. So this is not me picking and choosing. I'm going to read it in its, not in its entirety, but a pretty large chunk of it. And this is coming directly from the government website as it's translated into English. The sinification of Christianity is not only an objective requirement for the Chinese church's own development, but also the expectation of the party and the government. In recent years, the party and government repeatedly emphasized the importance of doing religious work well, and that the party's basic directives on religious work should be implemented, persisting in orienting towards the sinification of religions in China, and actively guiding the adaptation of religion and socialist society. In this historic time when socialism with Chinese characteristics has entered a new era, advancing the sinification of Christianity, continuously strengthening the conscientiousness identification with contemporary China in terms of politics, conscientious adaptation, establishment of deep bonds and kinship with the Chinese people, sharing the joys and sorrows of the motherland, and feeling common cause with the people, and contributing to the achievement of the two sentinel goals and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and the China dream have already become the consensus of Chinese Christianity. Now, if that didn't make any sense, congratulations. It didn't make any sense while reading it either. Why? Because China likes to use a lot of big words and conjoin them together as if it makes it more pretty when you're using really difficult words. I don't know if you've ever been to China, but if you ever work with any of the officials in China, they have the longest names. They'll have longest titles. I mean, their names are short. Chinese names are Chen, Shu, Lin. So you have a lot of, it's just really one syllable. But when it comes to titles, oh my gosh, then you need two business cards just to cover the entire title. It'll say something like Assistant to the Regional Development Manager of Opportunities for the Propaganda of the Chinese Communist Party in Jilin Province, whatever. And that will be like the title of the person that you're going to be meeting with. So when you read these statements, they don't really make sense when you read them all together, but when you pick them apart, you find items that stand out. First of all, it says that the sinification of Christianity is not just the church's own desire, but it's expected by the party and the government. Which means that when it's expected by the party and the government, the church does not have a choice. You can call it a desire if you want. That's cute. But it's enforced by the government. It also goes on to say that the party and the government has repeatedly emphasized the importance of doing religious work well. What does that mean? It means that you don't cause problems with your religion. It means that you use your religion to support the Chinese government. It means that if your religious work does not support the Chinese government, then you're not doing your work well. What in the world would Chinese Communist Party officials know about Christianity when, in order to become a Communist Party official, they have to take an oath of atheism? Which then again begs the question, what does an atheist know anything about doing religious work well? They don't. It's a joke. It's the same joke that we see in Hong Kong, where the Chinese Communist Party comes in and they correct Hong Kong and they take over the elections because they say, you don't know how to run a democracy. I'm sorry. And we're going to take a lecture from you, the Communist Party, that has never exercised democratic votes of the people at all, ever, ever, ever. The Communist Party, which is a dictatorship, is going to dictate how people exercise their democratic rights in another place. Same thing here with Christianity. We're not Christians, but we're going to tell you how to do your Christian work well. It also says, in this historic time of socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's a cute way of saying that we're communists, but communism is such a dirty word, so we're using the word socialism. Do you know what the difference is between socialism and communism? About 10 years. People often say, oh, Sweden is socialist. No, I'm in Sweden now. It's not socialist. You can say cute things that it's socialist and say that, oh, well, they have universal health care. Trust me, we spend less on healthcare here in Sweden than the United States does. I had more socialist healthcare in the United States than what I have here in Sweden. I have more socialist healthcare in the United States than I have in China. You're like, how is that possible? Side note, I'm a Swedish citizen, but I don't pay Swedish taxes, which means that I don't have my number in the system. So even though I have a Swedish passport, I can take my Swedish passport and have to the hospital when I'm hurt, but I have to pay in cash. Why? Because I'm not in the system. Although I'm a citizen, they can see from their computers that I don't pay Swedish taxes. Therefore, if you don't pay Swedish taxes, you don't get Swedish benefits. That's not very socialist, or it's not as socialist as America. Where in America, I grew up poor, in a poor home. We got everything, including healthcare, for free. So many people are like, oh, poor people are dying without healthcare. That was never true. I don't want this to get political, and I hate to hurt your feelings if you believe that it is, but I grew up on welfare. I grew up on food stamps. I grew up on WIC vouchers, government cheese, the whole 9 yards. In a government apartment, Valley View Apartments in Hartford City, Indiana. And I can tell you that I got free dental and free medical. Never paid a dime for any of those things. There was always different programs that I could get on, or my family could get on, that my healthcare was provided. You know when I had to start paying healthcare? When I became more middle class. Or when I'm in Sweden. I have to pay in Sweden. And I have to pay in China when I'm in China. So they like to call places like Sweden, Norway, Denmark socialist, but I will put the tax rates in America up against the tax rates in Sweden. We pay more in taxes. They're like, oh, no, we don't. No, you got to look at the taxes correctly. In America, you pay federal taxes, state taxes, city taxes, county taxes, sales tax, community tax, depending on which community you live in, especially if you have a homeowners association. At the end of the day, you pay much more taxes and get much less. So ease up on socialism for a second, because China is trying to adopt the socialist terminology to sell communism. It's not socialism, it's communism that China is trying to sell, but they don't like the word communist when they're talking with Western countries, so that's why they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's why it's called Christianity with Chinese characteristics. You see what they're trying to do? They're using the verbiage, but they're changing the meaning. We'll use the word socialism, but just change the meaning by saying it has Chinese characteristics. We'll use the word Christianity, but we'll change the meaning by saying it has Chinese characteristics. This is the Sinanization of Christianity. This is the Chinification of Christianity. Wrong. This is the communization of Christianity. That's what's really happening here. That's what that document's really talking about. It is the communization of Christianity, not the Chinanization or the Chinification or the Sinanization. This is exactly what Pastor Amos was talking about with the one church of China. I hope you learned a little bit from this podcast. Again, I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of Sweden. God bless.